past midnight on the north-south expressway. The rain was coming down in sheets, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Mary gripped the steering wheel of her deep blue, second-hand Toyota Camry so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was alone, driving back to Kuala Lumpur after a late delivery in Ipoh. The air conditioning was off, yet the interior of the car was freezing. A coldness that didn't feel natural. It felt heavy. Suddenly, a smell hit her. It wasn't the exhaust fumes or the damp upholstery. It was a sharp, chemical bitterness. It tasted like old brass keys and burnt plastic. A scent Mary knew too well from her childhood growing up near the agricultural lands, the unmistakable, toxic smell of pesticide. It was past midnight on the north-south expressway. The rain was coming down in sheets, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Mary gripped the steering wheel of her deep blue, second-hand Toyota Camry so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was alone, driving back to Kuala Lumpur after a late delivery in Ipoh. The air conditioning was off, yet the interior of the car was freezing. A coldness that didn't feel natural. It felt heavy. Suddenly, a smell hit her. It wasn't the exhaust fumes or the damp upholstery. It was a sharp, chemical bitterness. It tasted like old brass keys and burnt plastic. A scent Mary knew too well from her childhood growing up near the agricultural lands, the unmistakable, toxic smell of pesticide. Rewind back to 2002. Life was a constant hustle for Mary. She was in her late 40s then, a hard-working woman with a kind face, usually seen in her comfortable cream sweater and a simple red skirt. She ran a small home-based sewing business in a quiet suburb of Selangor. Times were tough. Her husband, Uncle John, a man over 70 with a steady but tired demeanor, spent months away at a time, managing far-flung construction sites to keep the family afloat. When he was home, he'd sit in his brown and cream striped shirt and gray trousers, sighing about the costs of living. For years, Mary had a single dream. A dream that felt almost luxurious in their financial state. She wanted a car. She needed something to help transport her fabric, deliver finished clothes, and occasionally pick up the children when they were still schooling. Relying on public transport and expensive taxis was draining. The opportunity finally arrived through a friend. A deal that seemed too good to pass up. It was a 1992 Toyota Camry. 10 years old but looking almost new. It belonged to a middle-aged man who claimed he was upgrading. The price was significantly lower than the market value. Mary, cautious but eager, had a mechanic friend inspect it. Aside from some minor cosmetic wear, the engine was solid. No signs of major accidents, no flood damage. She remembered the day she drove it home. The sense of pride. The feeling that life was finally getting a little easier. Even the neighbors complimented the classic car. Mary smiled, believing this deep blue vehicle was the key to a smoother future. The first hint of trouble didn't even happen inside the car. It was the very first night after she bought it. She had parked the Camry neatly in front of their terrace house. Around 2 a.m., Mary jolted awake. Her throat was burning. A horrific, sharp stench filled the bedroom. She went to the kitchen, checking for gas leaks or burnt food. Nothing. She realized the smell was coming from outside, drifting through the open window. It was that bitter, chemical smell of pesticide. She pulled back the curtain. The street was empty. The Camry sat silently under the orange glow of the street lamp, windows rolled up tight. The smell seemed to emanate directly from it. Mary convinced herself she was being neurotic. New cars often had strange odors from chemical cleaners, she reasoned. The next morning, when she unlocked the car, the smell was gone. The interior was spotless, with only the faint, sweet scent of the car air freshener she had hung. She laughed off her night terrors. But the anomalies began to escalate, moving from sense to sensations. Mary began to notice that if she drove the Camry after 9 p.m., the interior temperature would drop drastically. The aircon dials would be set to neutral, yet the air in the cabin became brittle and frigid. She would look down at her arms and see the goosebumps rise through the fabric of her cream sweater. She'd checked the dashboard, but the indicators showed everything was normal. One evening, she was driving home through a dilapidated industrial area. The roads were dark, lined with closed factories. The quiet inside the car was broken only by the engine's purr. Mary gasped, nearly swerving the car into a drain. She checked the back seat in the rearview mirror. It was empty. She rolled down her window, desperately seeking fresh air and a connection to the outside world, but the streets were desolate. When she reached home that night, the pesticide smell was clinging to her clothes. The most disturbing incident occurred while Uncle John was home. Mary needed to deliver a large order to Malacca, and she asked John to drive. It was a clear afternoon as they sped down the highway. Uncle John, usually a quiet driver in his brown and cream shirt, seemed to be enjoying the smoothness of the car. Suddenly, without anyone touching it, the car radio blared to life. It wasn't tuned to any station, just a wall of chaotic static. Uncle John, slightly annoyed, reached over and turned it off. 3 seconds later, the static was back, even louder. John mumbled something about faulty wiring and turned it off again, holding the dial this time. Through the chaos of the static, they both heard it. Not interference. A voice. Or rather, the sound of someone struggling to breathe. A harsh, desperate choke. SFX, a gargling, desperate gasping sound drowning out the static. Then, the static died. John's face turned gray. He slowly took his hand off the radio, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He didn't say a word, and Mary didn't dare ask what he had just heard. They knew. The breaking point arrived at 4 o'clock in the morning, a few days after the trip to Malacca. Mary had woken early to finish a sewing project. As she walked past the front window, her gaze naturally went to the driveway. The Camry was locked, but the interior wasn't dark. The dashboard was faintly glowing with a weak, ghastly green light. Mary assumed she had left the ignition slightly engaged. She went to the front door, planning to rush out and shut it off. She stopped at the threshold. Through the front windshield of the Camry, she saw someone sitting in the driver's seat. It wasn't Uncle John. It was a man, very thin. Slender. The green light from the dashboard illuminated the back of his neck. He was hunched over, his forehead resting on the steering wheel, his hands hanging uselessly in his lap. He looked utterly broken. Despondent. Mary remained frozen in her doorway, the cool dawn air chilling her. She stared at the figure for what felt like hours, too terrified to speak or approach. A split second later, the weak green light flickered and died. The figure was gone. The next morning, Mary did what she should have done weeks ago. She called the friend who had connected her with the seller. Mary's voice trembled as she demanded to know the real story behind this car. The friend was evasive at first, but Mary's intensity wore him down. He finally confessed. The seller she met wasn't the owner, he was just a broker hired to get rid of it. The actual owner had been a young tea merchant, a man barely 30. He was in desperate debt. Last year, he had driven the Camry to a desolate riverside spot on the edge of town. He had parked, rolled up the windows, and locked the doors. Then, he had consumed a bottle of highly concentrated, lethal pesticide. The friend told Mary that when the authorities found him, they had to break the window. He hadn't died instantly. It was an excruciating, agonizing way to go. He had spent hours in that locked, deep blue car, suffering the tortures of internal chemical burns, choking, gasping, and regretting. The police reported the car's interior was saturated in the smell. Mary hung up the phone. Her mind went blank. Everything clicked into place. The smell, the coughs, the terrible chill, the desperate shadow. She didn't feel fear anymore. She felt an overwhelming, crushing sadness. She realized she wasn't dealing with a monster, but a memory. The residual echo of a man's final, bitter mistake. She understood that the pesticide smell was a haunting, but the taste she often got on her tongue wasn't the chemical, it was the abstract bitterness of absolute regret. The activity in the car intensified after Mary knew the truth. When she was stressed about money, the pesticide smell became suffocating. If she and Uncle John argued, the dashboard lights would flash hysterically. She started having a recurring nightmare. She was in the Camry, but she wasn't the driver. She was in the passenger seat. Beside her, in the driver's seat, sat the previous owner. His face was a blurry mess of pale gray, but she could clearly see his torso. He was a slender, 30-year-old male, shockingly fit, his visible six-pack definition visible beneath a tattered, tear-streaked shirt. He looked physically strong but spiritually broken. In the dream, he would turn to her and say that life was bitter, but drinking the poison was more bitter, and that he regretted it with every fiber of his being. Mary would wake up, the actual taste of bitter chemical on her tongue. Mary couldn't handle it anymore. She couldn't sell it to anyone else, knowing what she knew. She wouldn't inflict this nightmare on another unsuspecting family. Instead, she called a towing service. The day the tow truck arrived, Mary wore her usual cream sweater and red skirt. The weather was turbulent, a strong, restless wind whipping around the house. As the Camry was hooked onto the tow lift, Mary stood at her gate, watching. She didn't feel relief. She felt like she was watching a funeral. As the rear wheels lifted off the ground, a blast of intense, concentrated pesticide odor erupted from the vehicle, stronger than it had ever been. It almost made Mary choke. But she stood her ground. She stepped forward and addressed the car directly. She spoke softly but firmly into the howling wind. She told him that it was over. He needed to let go of this blue shell and stop being trapped in his final moments. She urged him to find the place he was supposed to go. She told him that life couldn't be done again, so he must stop holding on to the regret. As she spoke, the wind suddenly changed direction, blowing away from the house, and the horrific scent instantly vanished, carried off towards the horizon. Mary watched the tow truck pull away with the deep blue Camry. She never had that nightmare again. She never smelled that pesticide smell again. But sometimes, even now, 15 years later, if she smells something even vaguely similar to agricultural chemicals, her heart will squeeze, paralyzed by a memory of absolute despair. The Camry was just a shell of metal and tires, but it carried the heaviest cargo imaginable, a human being's final, eternal regret.
Hi, if you enjoy this story, please like and subscribe. To ensure you don't miss the continuation, make sure to hit the notification bell